Welcome to Legal Resources Radio, where we invite you into the world of social justice, advocacy, and public interest law. Throughout this podcast series, we'll share stories, insights, and expert advice from our dedicated team at the Legal Resources Center, as well as from our valued guests. In each episode, we'll dive into the legal landscape, tackle pressing social issues, and aim to empower you with the knowledge to make a difference. Whether you're a community activist, a legal professional, passionate about social justice, or just curious, this is the place for you. So wherever you are, washing dishes, at work, on the bus, train, or plane, or just relaxing at home, plug in your headphones, take a deep breath, and get ready to begin.
Welcome, guys. This is the Legal Resources Radio podcast from the LRC. First, on top of the show, I just want to apologize. We didn't get you an episode out in January. It was a lot crazier than I thought it was going to be. So we have a surprise for you for February. We're going to give you two podcasts. It's going to be a two-parter: South Africa, the surveillance state, or a state surveilled. In part one, we're going to talk to Jane Duncan about, surveillance in general. But now in studio today is part two, and we've been talking about facial recognition technology. We're going to call it FRT for short, but I'm sure Murray is going to correct me that we should say things in full. Wait and see. This tech is very much in South Africa. It's not something that we've developed ourselves. It's kind of being dumped in by the European countries predominantly. And it's a system that's been highly criticized. It's has biases towards people of black or of color complexions, and it raises serious human rights concerns for that reason and for many others. And so today we're very lucky to be joined by Murray Hunter from the public interest advisory firm called Alt Advisory. He is a Bertha Activist Fellow. He is a Ruth First Fellow, and he's an author of many reports and publications, also co-author of many reports and publications that have been, dealing with communications surveillance, but also data protection. And he's an expert in this field, and we're very lucky to have him. So I hope you really enjoy this part two of the South Africa surveillance state, or a state surveilled. Good morning, Murray. Thank you for joining us. How are you?
I'm excellent, thank you. I trust you're well as well.
Thank you. I'm doing okay.
It's been wonderful catching up.
Yeah. And so, the last time we met, you were with us at our sort of conference that we did, and you spoke to us a little bit about facial recognition technology. And I thought it would be really cool to get you back here in the studio with us and, talk to us again about facial recognition technology so that our listeners on the LRC Legal Resources Radio podcast could hear your insights. So we have a bit of a theme going this week. We're going to be interviewing Jane Duncan as well, and she's going to talk to us a bit about the surveillance state in South Africa. But specifically with you, I want to talk about facial recognition technology, like I said. And so when I think about facial recognition technology, I'm going to say FRT because I keep swallowing my words. When I think about FRT, I think about cop shows. I think CSI. You see these big tech screens where they're like mapping people's faces, and they get exactly the right person, on the screen. Mm-hmm. And they're like, okay, that's our guy. Let's go after him. Bring me back down to earth, or bring us all back down to earth. What is FRT? And in South Africa specifically, what is the capacity of FRT here?
Sure. So the first thing is, I'm not going to say FRT. I'll just call it facial recognition, mainly because I think so many of these things that really matter and affect people's lives, we buried them in acronyms. And that's kind of part of one of the things that makes it very difficult to fully get people's attention on these issues. So if it's not going to make us run over time, I'm going to go with facial recognition. You can call it what you want. I should say I'm not a technologist. I'm sure that what I'm about to describe is maddening if you're like a facial recognition technologist, like engineer or whatever. But I think for the purposes of ordinary people, it's any system which analyzes an image or a moving image and reads a face and tries to cross-reference that with an existing database of images to say, okay, I'm going to scan this face and I'm going to figure out if I can find a match for that in this database, and then say, okay, this is actually like this random person, this is Kamal in the, sort of like in the database. Now the question of like what is the state of facial recognition in South Africa?
Yeah.
It's an interesting question because the technology like crosses borders, right? It's like these are not government technologies; these are private sector technologies, and they're hawking them to governments, to companies all over the world. And so, truthfully, like most of the facial recognition powers in South Africa probably exist in the private sector. Our government is trying to develop a sort of like its own sort of combined database of faces and other biometric information. But as we're going to discuss, it's not really clear how far they got on that. So I guess the answer is like, what is the state of facial recognition in South Africa? It's pretty piss poor, but that's not necessarily a relief, because it's not like we don't really have these advanced capacities because we're so concerned about the technology and the safeguards aren't there, and so no one wants to roll it out. They're trying really hard. I just don't know that they're there yet.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned the private thing, and we'll talk a little bit more about it later. But I think, one of the reasons that I see, a demand for facial recognition technology or other terms of kinds of surveillance is there's always this obsession in South Africa. And I'm not saying that it's an unjustified obsession, but crime prevention. And what this leads to is there's a lot of a very small majority of South Africans who are primarily concerned with preventing crime because it's directly threatening them, versus a large population of people that are just trying to get by every single day. And so when we talk about surveillance technology and specifically facial recognition, what are the post-apartheid, post-colonial risks that these kind of techs bring to us?
So yeah, so, I mean, there's a lot of questions in that question, and I think that the first thing is, in South Africa, because crime is so ever present in most people's lives, that it is probably one of the biggest concerns and problems that people want solved for them, and in a way that's perfectly justifiable. Our crime rates are insane, and actually it's not really a minority concern. It's not something that is a concern of the leafy suburbs or of white South Africans or privileged South Africans. It is the further down the kind of economic or social food chain you go, the more violent crime touches your life, and in that kind of society, in that kind of culture, it really breeds an opportunity for security first solutions. And so facial recognition falls under that, more aggressive policing falls under that, more private security falls under that. There's a more interesting question about whether these different approaches actually meaningfully address the problem. Do they bring crime down? And with facial recognition, for example, there's a lot of questions about whether it's effective. And the first being, facial recognition is notoriously unreliable, and particularly notoriously unreliable when it comes to dark faces, essentially dark-skinned people. And often it has other biases, it might be less reliable at recognizing female faces, for example. There's a kind of bias in how these things were trained. They were trained on public data sets. They were often trained in the global north, or on scraped images from the internet. And the internet leans North American, it leans white, it leans male. And so that means that these technologies are actually much more accurate and reliable with white, male-presenting faces than with everyone else. So this presents a kind of a clear efficacy problem in general, but particularly in places in South Africa. That's thing one, efficacy around how reliable are these technologies. The second thing is what does facial recognition do? It allows you to, supposedly, if you can get the technology to work, it allows you to identify any person who comes into a public space. But where do these technologies get deployed? Just it's, for example, it might be public facing cameras on the street, whatever. And there are these studies that suggest actually what happens if you deploy cameras in a neighborhood is that you might reduce crime in that neighborhood. But it's not that you're reducing crime for the city, you're just displacing it to the next neighborhood over. The people who can't afford the cameras or whatever else. So while you're doing that, you're investing millions or even billions in a technology that firstly sort of displaces rather than solves the problem. Secondly, it gets out of date. Thirdly, it's kind of distributed unequally. And those millions or billions are just an opportunity cost. They could be sent to improving other forms of policing or public safety, could be addressing the root causes of crime, could be putting up streetlights or whatever. And so there's a question about whether facial recognition works, whether we should use it, but part of it is like it's just a shiny thing that draws people. You asked the question about our historical context, and we'll get to that. But fundamentally, this will probably be a theme in a lot of what I say. Facial recognition, like a lot of surveillance technology, is basically people hoping that there's a software solution for like an institutional problem.
Yeah.
Like, can we get a technology that will solve the fact that our institutions are failing, that our society is not really working in the way it's meant to? And if we could just buy this 2 billion rand technology, we can solve a governance problem. And there's lots of reasons to think that that is kind of a mistake, but it's very, very difficult. Like, I'm weirdly sympathetic towards the officials who are sitting like in their offices trying to figure out what the hell they're going to do, and then someone puts together a sales brochure for them that says, buy this thing and it'll just work magically, and suddenly you'll have all these advanced powers. And it's a real problem.
And you know, coming off of that, and we spoke a little bit behind the scenes about that, you know, neither you nor I actually know much about this system that I'm going to talk about in a second.
I thought I was speaking in confidence, but yes.
Yeah. But I think that kind of speaks to the issue that you've highlighted, right? Is that like we have these great ideas, technology is put in front of us. It's like, okay, let's implement it into our, you know, public systems. And so, you know, let's stop beating around the bush. I'm talking about the automated biometric information system. Now, this was something that was launched in 2016, collaboration between the Department of Home Affairs and a little bit with other sort of government departments, including the police. And essentially, the way I understand it, it was integrating the existing, you know, national population registry with our photos and our details into a more integrated system that included biometric stuff, including, you know, facial recognition. And as far as I understand it, it's supposed to give the police, you know, better access to these databases so that they, when they are looking at footage or they're looking at pictures, they can run FRT or facial recognition, I don't know, search in a way and determine who that person is, and then, you know, go and investigate. However, apparently there's been numerous issues with its implementation. But one thing that we have found out is that at least the facial recognition part of it is currently being used by SAPs. So we don't know where it is at the moment, but maybe let's just talk a little bit about what does that mean? Like, is the DHA system or SAP's mugshots, like, are those sufficient to set up a proper, you know, FRT facial recognition system that can be used properly for crime prevention or investigation?
So is it technically possible?
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, to my understanding, yes. So a lot of where we see, I mean, part of the problem we have is we have a system that firstly has been, as you said, like, it's stalled all these times. Like, there's all kinds of, this is like the government's big integrated biometric kind of identification system. And it's run into all these roadblocks, all these systems failures, procurement problems. And so the truth is, like, we don't really know where things are at. And secondly, there's a transparency problem because the officials involved aren't necessarily taking people fully into their confidence about where things are at. And the, you know, Parliament is not really asking these questions in the way that they should. They're more concerned about, like, for example, the fiscal problems. But that was a long way of saying that where these systems have been rolled out with a little bit more transparency, or it's been better documented, for example, they're often built off of databases of driver's licenses, or, you know, there's kind of other non-security related databases which have been scraped or acquired, and then those are used to either train the systems or to actually be the database, the reference database, to say, okay, can we find this image that we've scanned here, can we find that person in the database of driver's licenses? So theoretically, one assumes, like, the Home Affairs database is actually an incredibly powerful tool because it includes not only the faces, but the fingerprints, all these other things. The question of how SAPS is using it, it's very unclear to me. And maybe it's clear to someone, but I don't know that information has been very widely kind of scrutinized, because there's a question of, like, officially, what is the policy? Secondly, like, what gets said in, you know, organizational reports or, you know, presentations to Parliament, whatever. But often with other technology, what we found is, like, if you go and speak to a cop, like a detective or someone in the Hawks or whatever, they're like, yeah, I've heard about this thing, but like apparently you have to fill out a form and it takes 9 months or whatever. And so you might find like there's always, particularly in this kind of in a big, vast, and often pretty rickety institution like SAPS or like any other really any other part of our society, you find that there's this huge yawning gap between what is happening on the ground, what the official policy is, what's possible, etc. So that was a long answer to say, well, no. But I should point out something, because you asked earlier about the kind of historical context, and I never got there. There are like 2 or 3 things happening with this thing. It's like an everything app for government or for governance, and it's there's like kind of historical studies of the biometric system and population control in South Africa. So it's actually like the colonial system and the apartheid system really laid the groundwork for population control in South Africa, obviously. But things like the passbook, things like the original colonial administration wanted photographs of people so they could like figure out who belonged and who didn't. And so that is like part of the historical roots that we inherited in the post-94 dispensation. But there's a second thing, and it's not to say that like your smart ID is like, it's just like a passbook. It's obviously, that sounds pretty hysterical, and it is. But there's a second governance impulse that comes about in the sort of post-94 era, which is suddenly a new government inheriting a citizenship which effectively legally didn't exist until then, with these deep needs for like real government support and intervention, like to transform our society. And that's a really difficult thing to do, because you have to figure out who your citizens are and what they need, and you need to be able to identify them. You need to be able to find them and identify them and confirm that they're thing in order to give them anything from a house to healthcare to like to literally the documents that sort of prove your existence. And so those 2 competing impulses kind of exist together in our current system. And then there's a third thing, which is like very much like a post-94 thing of this developing xenophobia of our government, a huge hostility towards African migrants from other countries who are coming in the sense that this is the big threat. And those 3 things actually exist together, because they're trying to do a sort of a social services. We want to identify our citizens so we can help them. Then there's the policing thing. We want to find the crooks so we can catch them. And then the third thing is like the anti-immigration thing, which is we want to clamp down on this surge of unwanted people who we believe are coming in and sort of making our life so difficult. And they've essentially tried to develop a technology that can do all 3 of those things. It's not really clear that it is doing any of those things very effectively, but it is, for example, if you look at how Home Affairs systems run so unreliably for everyone, you go in to get an ID book or whatever, but the machine is down today. But they can only give you an ID card if you're there once they take the photograph in the special booth. But when I go, at least, like, it seems to go down every 20 minutes for 20 minutes. And, so like, is this deep impulse, how they're trying to create this like all-powerful system, but actually it's just kind of shit technology that is making a struggling institution even worse. And I guess that is the kind of, we have a situation where they really wanted a sword, but it's like a sword without a hilt, and it doesn't really, it doesn't do the things it's supposed to do, and it makes things worse. What was the question?
No, I mean, I think you answered it perfectly. And I think, what I'm getting is that, the infrastructure that is underlying what they want to put on top of it isn't strong, right? We don't have a system in place where we can then put facial recognition or other types of surveillance technology on top to make that, foundation any stronger. We need to, like you said, focus on issues of governance and policy. And that kind of brings me to this follow-on question about what is the lawful process when we're implementing stuff like this. As far as I'm aware, if we're going to introduce a new system that directly impacts our right to privacy, our right to dignity, the rights of accused, arrested, and detained people, surely the system has to have some kind of public participation process. You and I just spoke about the fact that we don't know very much about what's happening with the automated biometric information system. But surely we should know. Surely we should be involved at every step of the process so that we can make comments on it or make suggestions, because that's our democratic rights according to the Constitution. But that hasn't happened. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the International Network of Civil Liberty Organization report that the LRC did in a second. But I kind of want to get your opinion first on what is the regulatory framework at the moment in South Africa. And we spoke a little bit about, behind the scenes, we spoke a little bit about, I'm not going to try and name it in full because I can never get it right, but the RICA Act. I know the A stands for Act already, so I don't need to double say it, but the RICA Act. And how that was struck down by the Constitutional Court. And now we're kind of sitting in a space where we don't really have a surveillance regulatory framework. So in place of that, what do we have? What are SAPs using to justify the use of ABIS, or DHA using to justify the use of it?
Yeah, so the RICA Act, that's the communication surveillance law. And so firstly, it only applies to communication. So it's basically a signal between you and me, or between you and a computer server somewhere.
So even if it existed, it wouldn't even have dealt with what we're talking about today.
Indeed, yeah. And I think, and again, like that kind of has its roots in like the kind of the apartheid law they, inherited, where it was like wiretapping off of like a landline, and they sort of tried to update it and make it constitutional, and got some of the way there in the early 2000s. So the court struck it down in 2021, I want to say, because there was kind of like, it finally was conclusively proved that the lack of safeguards in that surveillance law were being used to spy on the phones of journalists, and hadn't adequately protected privacy in the way that the Constitution demanded. What basically happened is that the court said, until Parliament fixes this law, we're going to write in these kind of emergency provisions that need to be followed, and then, Parliament will pass a new law that will be much more constitutional. And they eventually did. They passed like a little 8-page thing that did the bare minimum. And then actually, I think it was late November last year, the president sent it back to Parliament to say, to his absolute credit, he said, I don't think this is constitutional, I don't think I could sign it. And so the same people who created the problem in the first place, they've introduced a new bill. I haven't looked at it. It was like in Parliament this week.
Yeah.
But I think our discussion is not really about RICA, but it is an indication of the extent to which, like, there's not really anyone at the wheel on a lot of these questions, because in order to prove to a court that it needed to make a very far-reaching decision, essentially to strike down a security or policing law, and this is not a South African problem. Courts in general and lawmakers in general are very, very wary of tinkering with national security. There's a kind of a human bias towards saying, well, if it's security related, we don't want to, we don't want to cut the wrong wire. So, like, there's always a little bit of an exemption. Not just a legal one, but also a kind of cultural exemption towards national security powers. And in order to get a court to finally step up and take the decisions that happened in the RICA case, it took like years and years of journalism, of kind of activism, of documenting what was happening. Like, I went and looked up every police detective who would speak to me to kind of interview them to say, how is this actually working? Like, what kind of safeguards would you agree to? Like, how much would it actually make your life more difficult if you could only use this for murder cases and not for like petty fraud or whatever? And it took all of that information to be drawn into the public light to get a court to make this far-reaching decision. And unfortunately, we need that kind of action on all of these laws, where often what's happening is the regulations are being drafted after the power has kind of been brought into being. Yeah. And that's what's happening with Home Affairs, for example. They started doing this big biometric project in 2016. I think they started updating the regulations sometime around like 2019, 2020. Yeah. And I don't think it's still in draft form. I think it might have been finalized. So a lot of moving balls, then I'm not looking at that one, to be honest. Yeah. But they're kind of like, they're retrospectively trying to create a policy to justify the power, not the other way around. And it's really tricky, because you're right, there should be more public participation, but truthfully, this is not something that sits front in mind for lots of ordinary South Africans. And even when it does, there's all these different things happening. So, for example, this thing of like, South Africans are I think that they are, because of the rate of, for example, financial kind of fraud and like people getting ripped off by companies or having data stolen or having like their ID cloned or whatever, they're South Africans are actually a lot more wary, I think, of their personal information, or protective of their personal information than they get given credit for. But at the end of the day, people also want to be in the housing system. They want to be in the social ground system, and getting so people don't want to be off the grid. They want to be on the grid because they really need that kind of support. And so there's those two competing things. Yeah. And then when, for example, the government is saying, actually, this is really about making sure that those foreigners are not committing identity theft and getting documentation they're not supposed to have, which, by the way, is not a technological problem. That is officials in Home Affairs who are creating fraudulent documents. There's not a technological solution to that, right? But it's like all of these things. It makes it very difficult for the public to actually meaningfully engage with these questions and to be meaningfully given a place at the table, even if those public participation opportunities existed. And there's other things. I think this is not really the topic we're meant to be discussing, and I realize I've been speaking for about 8 minutes.
That's okay.
But I think we don't reflect that much on how much the COVID era has changed public participation. Like there are things that happen. I think civil society shrunk in some ways and transformed in some ways. Parliament is no longer they're predominantly meeting virtually now. There's not like a lot of these meetings are not happening in a room where you can go and sit there and you can engage with the members like offline, like give them your things. It's a Zoom call. And we're doing policy making on Zoom calls now. And that's not just COVID, that's also like Parliament got set on fire, so they they have to meet in other places.
Yeah, of course.
And also like what happened with the Department of Justice when it screwed up the amendments to the RICO surveillance law, where they genuinely like, okay, well fine, we've got to do this. The court said we have to do this. And they did nothing for nearly 2 years. Yeah. And then they quickly got some new officials who'd never looked at this before, had to write it up because the last official died, and officials, during COVID, and officials kind of burnt out and all these other things. And so I think that has led to we didn't exactly have a thriving public sphere in the first place, but I think that there has been a kind of erosion of the public sphere further, that is kind of like a really undocumented factor in all of this.
I think the COVID point is really important, even though it's not like facial recognition related. We get quite a few clients that come in through our doors and speak about the fact that they were given blanket amnesty in terms of renewing their permits during COVID, and now that COVID is over, they don't really know, are they allowed to go back? Are they even allowed to just walk in? They have to make appointments, and then they don't get responses on emails. It's really like kind of, as you said, dismantle the systems as we know it, and then now we're just trying to pick up the pieces and keep going. But let's get back to what we were talking about. So as I mentioned, the LRC are part of this international network of civil liberty organizations, and we developed this report or set of guidelines called Eyes on the Watchers Challenging the Rise of Police Facial Recognition report. There are 18 principles in this thing. I'm not going to go through every single one of them.
I've got the time, let's do all 18. Alphabetically. No, okay.
No, I'm teasing. But there are a couple that I thought were really important. A lot of them talk about legal reform and due process. We don't have a legal system on facial recognition, so we can't even really, we'll just be like, not applicable, not applicable, not applicable. So let's talk about the ones where we can maybe have a proper conversation on it. So principles 2 and 5 talk about before implementing a facial recognition system, we need to do impact and human rights assessments. And then later on, 17 and 18 talk about setting up an oversight body that then monitors whether or not the FRT system is compliant with human rights and existing surveillance laws. I can kind of preempt, I know what you're going to say, but do we see any push from government to do these kind of assessments? Because you spoke about those 3 really important points about the way FRT could impact our society and the things that they need to take into consideration. there are a lot of human rights considerations within each, the xenophobia, the citizenship, and then the sort of national security issue. So if the answer is no, we haven't done human rights assessment, why would it be important to do that, considering what you were talking about earlier?
Yeah. So you're right. I don't think we've done those things. But it's because those are grudge purchases, right? And they're chores for government, because fundamentally their impulse is different. Their impulse is control, is to police, to control, and to monitor, like that. And that's I'm sympathetic. I think that's just how states think. It's not that we've got baddies. It's just how states think. Yeah. And I will say, like, one of the things, I mean, this is going back to RICA, but one of the things I value with RICA is that the policy is not created by the police or by the intelligence agencies. The policy is created by our Department of Justice. So and what you often have is the institutions that are seeking the power write the rules that will govern that power. They introduce these things. And so I think it's like, for example, the biometric policy that's developed by Home Affairs. And their main concern is collecting as much data as they possibly can justify in case it becomes useful, or to solve all these kind of problems, real and imagined, that keep them up at night. And so like the guardrails are being, or I guess like the chicken coop is being kind of created by the foxes. Yeah, I mean, I guess the other thing, I mean, this is again, like, it's going back to the kind of COVID point, and like these kind of hidden things, is like the state's lawmaking capacity is as poor as it's ever been in the democratic dispensation, as far as I can see. And this is why, if you go into Parliament, half or more of the bills that are being worked on in the Justice Committee are reform bills. They are amendments that have been created largely because a court has struck down some aspect of policy. And so they are just trying to fix the kind of the problems in legislation that they already drafted. And in some cases, like in the RICA example, there's like problems that never should have been arisen, like problems that never should have like been put into policy. And in those circumstances, like, no, there's no impact assessment. If there is an impact assessment, it will not be meaningful. I'm also sympathetic because these are kind of sometimes relatively new requirements. Like, these are new approaches to policy that officials are just like everyone else. They sit at, like, it's a person sitting at a desk trying to figure out how to do a thing. And so it's not that great. But I think in a climate where people's, like, the kind of the push factors, like the things that get the citizens and the officials like really excised are the crime, the kind of the xenophobic fears, etc. And so I don't think the human rights concerns are front and center. But I think that the human rights concerns are important, obviously. But I think we need to take a broader step back, because there's actually a cost-benefit analysis that needs to happen with all of these things. And it's not only the financial cost, although we generally don't consider that in a meaningful way. It's also the human rights costs, and also the human rights benefits. There may be kind of things in the other column. And then it's like this kind of broader opportunity cost of, like, is this the place where we want to put our policy-making energy, our governance energy, and our kind of financial kind of resources, because every time we're doing one of these things, we're leaving something else on the table. And for example, in the case of the biometrics, like this kind of like this huge mass programs, like they take 8 to 10 years to roll out at best. And then you discover 10 years from now that the technology is outdated, and they start the process again. It's why we're doing it. This is replacing an old system that was developed on exactly those bases. And then they discover, like, oh, this thing doesn't really work. We need a new system. Let's put out a tender for, like, all these kind of European companies to come and, like, showcase their fancy new thing, and they will they will give us a software solution to our institutional problem.
Yeah, and I think, one of the common themes in civil society last year and going into this year now is that we're dealing with a government that's going through austerity, right? They're cutting costs in all of these kind of places. And we will say to them, like, so for the education stuff and the health stuff, is it really necessary to be cutting costs there? Now, I'm not saying that they're cutting costs there so they can put money towards ABIS or a new system for Home Affairs, but it does seem like maybe like what you're alluding to is that we really need to consider about where is the important places to put money. If we're going through austerity and we need to cut costs, and we understand that, you know, the things that are going on internationally and with state capture considerations, money is tight. But then, you know, is a fancy new CCTV system in South Africa with facial recognition technology really necessary? But okay, so I want to talk about something you spoke a little bit about at the top. So principles 15 and 16 of our report spoke about the issue of misidentification. And I think, you know, the big examples of this have, I mean, at least as far as I know, have come out of America, right? There was the Robert Williams case where he was misidentified by a facial recognition technology system, which had AI embedded, I believe. Apparently he was the 9th most likely match in the lineup that the AI system had put out towards the cops. Now bringing it back home a little bit, we have a majority Black and person of colors population. We're then going to try and implement a system which we then know the technology is biased towards individuals of that, you know, sort of appearance. I mean, how can we do that? Like, it does, and especially without a human rights assessment of that kind, like it kind of seems like not so well thought through from that perspective.
So, who knows? Maybe the reasoning was very sound. Maybe all of these things have happened. You know, let's give everyone the benefit of the doubt.
We don't know.
No, it's true. And I think part of it, I mean, so one of the reasons why I think these examples come out in the States, there's like probably 2 or 3. The first is that the technology is being deployed at a much higher level. Like I don't know all of those cases, but there's been at least 3 that have happened kind of in the Michigan, Detroit area. It's all based off one system, and that is not a government, like that's not a national or federal system. That is a city-wide system. So like, or maybe it's a statewide system, but basically like these are relatively small pockets of government. Like people can roll these things out. The second is that they don't have data protection laws, and then the third is that they've got these kind of like frankly, like the kind of the exterior institutions, the sort of like the watchdog institutions are slightly stronger. Those things are documented by in news media, documented and like kind of studied in academic fora, and then also sort of litigated by sort of civil liberties organizations like, you know, the American Civil Liberties Union. And those institutions, some of them might not be as strong as they used to be, like the news media, you know, etc. But there are more, there are kind of like more eyes on these things. As much as the abuses are higher, there's also more eyes on this thing. And like on this issue, you could probably fit everyone who's working on this issue sort of around this table if we squeezed. And so like it's a bit more difficult to document these things. And you have to like study them for quite a long time. But then the second thing is that the victims of these, if these abuses are being like occurring here, the victims are almost certain not to identify themselves because they don't necessarily know that that's how they got. Yeah. You know, they don't know how they got caught. And sort of if you've ever spent time in the kind of in the real sort of criminal justice system, which you might have, I'm not well versed in these things, but my understanding is like most of these things don't come to trial. Like someone sits in detention for a little while, maybe they get released, maybe they don't, maybe they will just take kind of a, you know, like a plea, or they'll get, you know, sort of rolled up in something else. But it's not like there's evidence being tabled in court and then the attorney, you know, like the sort of defense attorney is going to look at that and say, wait, hang on, this was not procedural or whatever. Like these things, they're just like one of the many abuses that happen that just sort of never really float to the surface. And it's kind of like there's an indicator. It's an indicator of another reason why we should be concerned is that we don't have these robust safeguards and like sort of institutions that can protect. Now the question is, should there have been an impact assessment? Why are they doing these things? There's another fact is like the industry sales pitch. I think is very compelling. You know, our states don't develop these technologies; they buy them. Or they often license them, you know, so they rent them for like 3 to 6 years or whatever. And we don't have very much scrutiny on who these sales kind of vendors are. They're often like companies, you know, that'll be like an Amazon or Microsoft or whatever, like they supply some of the infrastructure that these sort of systems run on. Or, you know, be an IBM or whatever. but we don't really have much scrutiny of these, like who's selling this stuff. And they probably got a pretty persuasive pitch, because they'll say, for example, well, no, all of these things you might have read, that's all a decade-old problem. We've solved it because, and the way we solve it is we collect many more images and media of other people, because this is the way, like people said, facial recognition has a racial bias, and that's a human rights concern. They said, we've got a human rights solution. We're going to collect 10 million photos of black people without their consent, and we're going to train the system on that, and now our system is better. And so that's it's not really, like, it's not a good thing, but I assume that is part of maybe what is driving that thing. And then fundamentally, yes, officials are always looking for a technological solution to a governance problem.
And speaking about the industry thing, and the last principle I'm going to torture you with is as Principle 9. And it speaks about this issue of using facial recognition on live and recorded images. Now, we were talking about the Home Affairs system. Those are still images. Those are photos from our passports, our driver's licenses and stuff. But in the private sector, I believe in Gauteng, there's a company called Vumacam that's set up about, there's loads and loads of cameras by Vumacam in Gauteng, but I believe 7,000 of them have embedded facial recognition technology in them. Now, I don't know, because it's private, they don't have to disclose this to me or to anyone else, but unless they get a PIA request, but let's not get into that. Whether or not the FRT is working on still images, or if it's working on moving images or recorded images that the Vumacam system sets up. But I kind of wanted to ask you, and let's pretend I don't know anything and I haven't read the report, but why is it problematic for moving images to have a facial recognition system on it? Like, what is the issue with that? And then let's just talk about, like, this private security industry in South Africa versus, policing from a public sphere.
So firstly, I should say that, to my knowledge, Vumacam has, its position still is that it does not use facial recognition technology. And I haven't read the report; it might be well documented there. But I think that's the company position.
Okay.
But they've also said once the technology improves, they're kind of open to doing it. So there may have been a change in the last few months, but I know that there was a thing where there's a much more closer partnership with Vumacam and the Gauteng and city authorities. They're also in eThekwini, by the way, and maybe one or two other metros. But in any case, like, kind of the broader principle, we tend to think of real-time kind of facial recognition technologies as being more invasive, and of, like, sort of, applied to moving images, for example. There is a slight problem with that kind of assumption. So, for example, the EU's AI Act, which was passed last year, creates kind of new sets of regulations and safeguards against certain kinds of what they call high-risk technologies, and some forbidden technologies. For example, it's forbidden in terms of the EU AI Act, as far as I know, to use facial recognition or other biometric identification on real time, like in real time. But it's exempt if you do it on recorded footage, and we think that's a bit of an error. I may have mangled the EU AI Act, and
I think you're right. Yeah.
very cool listeners to the LSE podcast are going to be typing away at me right now. But I understand, like, where that impulse comes from. But I think that the important thing is what we don't let go is this idea that post-fact, or like applying it to recorded images or to still images is less invasive. But I believe that the concerns around applying this technology to moving images is that it really allows for, like, an always-on surveillance machine. What we've got generally with technology now is stuff where it has to, like, necessarily tends to be used in a more targeted fashion, which is like, okay, there was an incident in this location, I'm going to go back to the footage and I'm going to look for a particular thing, and then I'm going to find a single suspect, and then I will, pursue it. But when we start applying it to live images and to moving images, what you've got is, like, the makings of, like, an always-on surveillance system, which is everyone passing beneath this camera is being tracked in real time. And what that is basically like a machine that has the kind of effective capacity of, like, being able to stop you every 100 feet and, like, empty your pockets, because it's kind of like it's on that. I think that's the way I've kind of described it, to sort of try to make the invasion feel a bit more material to people, because basically most people, like, I'm walking under the camera and I'm sorry, it's an unfortunate phrase, but like, I'm walking past this camera unmolested, but actually there is a kind of harm going on, but it just doesn't leave a bruise or a scrape, and that's why it's another reason why it's more difficult to make these. I think we need to work a bit harder to make these harms feel real to people, so that they can, I think, understand the real stakes.
I think, and I know you were hesitant about the example, but I think it's a really important way to put it, because one of the main issues, I believe, with what the RICA Act did was this idea of bulk surveillance, right? And that's what was one of the reasons why it was struck down, is that we're looking at one person, but we need access to a bunch of other people around that person so that we can, investigate that person. And all of those people around didn't have anything to do with your investigation. And so this idea of a constantly moving system, constantly molesting us without our consent, without our knowing. I mean, I'm not saying that investigators should tell the person they're investigating that they're doing this, but everyone around that person have no reason to be there. And we can get into a conversation about, data protection and all of that, but I'm not going to, because we're short on time. But I just wanted, Murray, to say thank you for joining us. It was a really insightful conversation, and I don't think I would have been able to, tackle this topic without you. So thank you. Keep an eye out for what Murray is doing. He works for Alt Advisory. It's an amazing public interest advisory firm, and they do some incredible work, including coming from Murray. So yeah, thanks, man.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for tuning in to Legal Resources Radio. We hope you enjoyed today's episode and gained some valuable insights. If you did, or even if you didn't, please remember to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Legal Resources SA, or visit our website at lrc.org.za for updates and exclusive content on the incredible work our team is doing. We'll see you on the next episode of Legal Resources Radio. Stay curious, stay inspired, and keep up the good fight.